empty-handed. Can I come just outside?
Good morning. My name is Taryn, and if we haven't met yet, I wish we could be here together in person. I miss all of you so much. So on Friday afternoon, May 22nd of this year, after a few months of being cooped up at home, like many of us were, under the shelter-in-place orders for this pandemic, I was finally alone. My older son, Colson, had just finished up his online classes for the day and asked to go ride his bike. And my younger son, who we've been distancing from all of our relatives the entire time up to this point, had his first visit with my mom. She had just picked him up. And like many of you, trying to work maybe from home, or you're not home and your kids are trying to school from home, there's just a lot of nuance to it. And so there wasn't really anywhere to go when I was finally alone, because we're not supposed to go anywhere, right? So I decided, it's Friday afternoon, my work is done, I'm going to crack open a can of paint, not what you thought I was going to say, and get out my stepladder, and I've been meaning to paint the walls in our living room and, fix all these holes, and I had schemes for like a brand new gallery wall, because my grandmother had just moved out of her little apartment and handed down some pictures and things, and I thought, this is what I'm going to do. It's going to be fun. Put on my pretty sweet Elephant Heart radio set list that I've been listening to a lot during the pandemic, and just got to work. And I cranked the music, was singing along, and just kind of enjoying myself. But before my son went out on his bike ride, I did get one of those little alerts that popped up on my phone that if you're like me, you get so many alerts that you just automatically swipe them without reading them. So I remember seeing the word like storm and warning and swiping, and that's about it. So I said, listen, I think there was something about a storm. I need you to be home in an hour, but go ride, leave me alone. And so he went out, said he'd be home within an hour. And so I'm on my stepladder, singing along, having a great time. And I do remember that it was kind of overcast, because for that time of day, I had to turn the lamps on in our living room to see the walls, because it was kind of dark. And I don't even think that I realized it was raining, but in the midst of all of it, the loud music, the singing, the sanding, and the spackling, I did hear my phone ring, and I did answer it, and it was my son, and he said, I'm not going to make it home before the storm because it's already here. I'm at Freedom Park under a bridge, and the wind is crazy. And I was like, oh my gosh, the music must have been really loud because I had no idea. And I said, no problem, I'll come and get you. So grab my keys and step out my front door onto my porch, and it is pouring. I had no idea what was going on, and the sky was kind of brown, and I look out, and I'm about to run to my car, and a UPS man had just pulled up, and he kind of, instead of getting out of his truck, just closed his window, and we just kind of locked eyes for a minute. And I looked up at kind of what he was looking at, and all the huge trees that line our street in front of our house were just like bending and cracking and snapping. And it was very quick, but I was thinking, I'm just gonna run really quick to my truck, but it's pouring. And then when we locked eyes, I was completely overwhelmed with the compulsion or the inspiration or the something to just do one thing. So much so that I yelled it out loud, and it was, run. And that's the whole story. That's all that happened. Not really. But a few thousand years ago, another woman stood at her front door during a storm. It was more of an era of persecution and unrest, really. And King Herod had started murdering leaders that were people of faith within the church. He'd already murdered James, and now he had the Apostle Peter chained up in prison, preparing him for a public lynching the very next day. And the early church met in homes, And they were afraid for their lives, obviously, because of the persecution. And one of the homes in which they gather with frequency was Mark's mother, Mary, her home. It was large enough to hold groups of people, and so likely she was a woman of means. And in Acts, we find a story of this early church clandestine prayer circle happening underway at Mary's home. And they were praying for Peter's survival and safety. And according to the account, a mysterious figure just appears in the middle of the night in prison and undoes the chains and the shackles and opens the prison doors and leads Peter out of prison and even opens the city gate so he can get out, and then just disappears. And he realizes this is an angel or a supernatural event of some sort. And so in Acts 12, it says, when Peter realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where many people had gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the outer gate, an enslaved girl named Rhoda answered. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was overwhelmed with the compulsion or the inspiration or the whatever you might call it to do one thing. So instead of running to my car in that moment, I turned back into my house. I spun, yelling run, to my dog, who also ran. And we only made it about 5 steps from the front door to the entrance of our basement stairs. And he leapt past me. I think he jumped down the entire set of stairs because he was already at the bottom when I looked down. And the thing that I had feared for the 5 years or so since we've been living there, one of the reasons we made our son move out of his attic bedroom that we had finished up there to a room adjacent to ours, which he loves. He's 16, he loves that. But after 100 years of standing over 5th Street, a huge 100-plus-year-old oak tree smashed down onto our home, piercing right through our house. And as I was on the very top step of the basement, I could see the branch in the hallway right where I had been standing next to me. It sounded sort of like an explosion, like a boom. I don't even know, but I do know that everything went black and the air was filled with plaster, which was like just thick dust. I could see the tips of branches, and for a moment I exchanged gazes in the dark with the little beady eyes looking up at me from the bottom of the basement stairs, and it was silent. And in what I truly thought might be the final moments of my life, we heard another sound, so terrifying that it was even bigger than the first. The sound of the entire house collapsing. Just booms and crashes and glass breaking and booms and crashes. And I had this paralyzing realization that if I keep going down this stairway, I don't know if I'm going to come back out. And so I found myself just frozen on the top stair, gripping the railing. In Acts 12, it says, when she recognized Peter's voice, Rhoda, she was so overjoyed she did not open the gate, but ran back in and told them that Peter was standing at the gate. She bolts upstairs to the prayer meeting. And you know the guy that you're all praying for, church people up here? Peter's here. I know him. And Mary says, OMG, Rhoda, you're amazing. And they all hug her and they jump and they're like, this is a miracle. This is amazing. That's not actually what happens. It says in verse 15, they say, you've lost your mind. But she kept insisting that it was Peter. And they kept saying, it is his angel. And Peter continued knocking. And when they opened the door and saw him, they were greatly astonished. Are you kidding me right now? No one told you that he was there? He motioned to them with his hand to be quiet, then related how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. He said, "Tell James and the brothers these things." And then he left and went to another place. Kind of like, be sure to tell the men about this, everybody, okay? Insert giant eye roll. You know what I mean? So let me get this straight. Rhoda, the uninvited guest to the party, an indentured servant, merely hears Peter's voice outside the door. And when you're her, expected to be seen, not heard, you learn to hear even when you can't see. And no one, including Mary, believed her. This is the foundation of our church. So while I was gripping the railing at the top of the basement steps, rather than going down further into the basement with the dog, and whether it was motherly instinct for my puppy son or divine intervention, the choice of flight over fight kind of kicked in. And because I once again felt the need to verbally process with my dog what the plans were, I yelled, "We've got to get out of here." And he ran up the stairs to me, and I grabbed him by his collar, and we made our way through the dark, out the other end of the house, through the back door, into the storm and everything blowing around in the backyard. And we couldn't get out of the yard because this is what was covering the entire front and top of our house. Now, the phone call I made to my husband when I finally got over to my next door neighbor's house, who I called in the rain, walking to their back door, telling them, "A tree fell on my house." And they opened their door, and part of their house is hanging off, and water is pouring in. Realized a tree didn't just fall on my house. I wasn't the only one. And so it was all kind of a blur, but I call my husband and say, "You have to go get Colson. He's at the park under a bridge, and I need to know that he's okay." We're okay. We're all right. And then we hear sirens, and we walk outside, and we realize that it wasn't my house collapsing that I had heard. It was that two more huge trees had fallen right in a row on top of the house. So the crashes I was hearing were the other trees falling and hitting my car and hitting other neighbors' houses. And the scene was pretty apocalyptic when you walked out there. Neighbors, all of us who had been social distancing the entire pandemic, were all outside in the street, crying, hugging each other, not social distancing. Austin from staff, Matt O'Neill, they showed up in the crowd somewhere. Everybody's in the rain. And we walked down the street, and there's just houses split in half, cars crashed, and miraculously, other than being traumatized, no one was hurt, not even a pet. And when we finally went back in the house, a little bit after, to kind of grab some things out of it, I saw the step ladder that I had been standing on just like an hour before. And as near-death experiences do, I asked myself, what if? What if I'd run to my truck? What if my son had ridden his bike all the way home? What if my younger son hadn't gone to my mom's, or Scott was still up in the attic like he had been that morning, working at a folding table for his at-home office? What if this happened at 4 a.m. instead of 4 p.m.? These are the questions that keep me up at night. But also, what if I'd actually just paid attention to the alert on my phone instead of being in a hurry to get my set list going, so I could do my spackling? What if I had just looked out the window and noticed that maybe it was like brown outside and everything was, garbage cans were blowing around? I mean, what in the world? What if I'd complained to the city about the trees that had been sending hints like, breaking off part of our roof every time the wind blew, or breaking the back window of my car every time we parked underneath it. Those were maybe little clues. What if I'd been more in tune with all of it and been hiding in my basement already with the dog like my neighbor was? But despite my obliviousness, if not for that call from my son in that moment, if not for the UPS driver exchanging that oh bleep kind of look with me, if not for that split second of terror and otherness that I believe was God's voice saying, run, things could have been so different. And I almost missed it. It's the what if. The sheer enormity of it is hard for me to articulate. And a few weeks ago, that UPS guy that exchanged looks with me, Donald, sent me this.
Holy, there was a lady standing at the front door. Holy
Oh, and while the king was looking down, the justice his thorny crown, the courtroom was a jam.
So there was some editing with the language, I promise. I hope I gave you the edited version. I'm just realizing that. I hope so. But we did not edit that soundtrack. That just was what was playing in the UPS truck. But if you could hear between all the bleeps that he said at the end, there was just a lady standing on that front porch. I don't know if you heard that. That was me he was talking about. Lady in the paint clothes with the keys in her hand. And I feel like all of us are kind of standing on that porch in this year, in the cataclysm that is 2020. You know, just a few weeks before this took place, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery had been murdered. A few days after the trees fell, George Floyd was murdered as well. And we were displaced, obviously, so we were put in a hotel by our insurance, which I'm grateful for, uptown. And at night, we began hearing the sounds of the protests and the grief and the guns and the yelling and the crying. We could see it in the streets below as our city was responding to the terror that had been happening. And it wasn't like this was just some sudden storm that popped up or something new. And if it surprised us, we weren't really listening or paying attention, because this murdering and discrimination against black bodies, it's generations old. We just now have smartphones to capture the tragedies. And I really struggle, especially today, telling you this story, because while I've wanted to share it with you and I wanted to do it when we're all in person, the way things are looking, I don't know when that exactly is going to be. But when I look at the photo of our house, the symbolism of it is not wasted on me. Seeing our decimated house throwing up its soggy contents onto the street, seeing our shelter in place become what you saw in those photos. It's not just a metaphor of the Hofert's 2020. I mean, I could drop kick this year if I could. But this is what really needs to happen to our lives and our hearts and our homes and the church as we know it, the pretty little walls of comfort and cluelessness and lack of cognizance that we've constructed. Hell is raging outside our front door, and we're too busy with prayer circles and spackling our walls. And our oblivion is oppression, my white siblings. Our self-involvement is bigotry, and our indifference is injustice. It's not even subjective. And this Christmas, I want you to be reminded of Mary, the mother of Jesus. But I also want you to be reminded of Mary, the mother of Mark, the godly homeowner. Throughout history, she's been heralded as some kind of heroic door-opening, prayer vigil party hosting matriarch. But the fact of the matter is, as one of our favorite authors, Austin Channing Brown, describes how white people can be, she was exhausting. A patriarchy perpetuator, a human trafficker, a racist who didn't believe women, blind to what was at her own front door because the messenger was someone whom she did not consider equal or worthy. And in the pyramid of equality or power or whatever you want to call it, throughout all of time, white men have been at the top, and then white women because of our proximity to white men, and then men of color because they are men. And who is the most vulnerable and the most marginalized of all of humanity? It's women of color. And Charles Blow, a writer, says, "We often like to make white supremacy a testosterone-fueled masculine expression, but it is just as likely to wear heels as a hood." And my white sisters, we have to ask ourselves right now more than ever, what are we actively doing to demolish our walls of privilege, prejudice, and to decenter ourselves? Who are we reading? To whom are we listening? If only we were as eager to tell our siblings of color, hey, let me watch the kids for you tonight, as we are to buy a Black Lives Matter shirt. If only we showed up as an ally instead of some kind of superior savior with the social media post to prove it. If only we would love her sons and fear for their lives like we fear for our own and do for our own. If only we would shut up and start listening. How could this pyramid fall? Feminism says women are equal. Its focus is gender discrimination, and its founding was traditionally a middle-class white woman movement. But womanism, also known as black feminism, says feminism doesn't go far enough. Author Alice Walker, also author of The Color Purple, said, "Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender." I love that. It's a darker shade of feminism. It gives visibility to the experience of black women and other women of color who've always been at the forefront of the feminist movement, yet marginalized and rendered invisible throughout history. Womanism seeks, according to womanist scholar Layli Mapiron, to restore the balance between people and the environment/nature and reconcile human life with the spiritual dimension. Look at that definition. Sounds a lot like heaven come to earth, does it not? Sounds a lot like the incarnation. Sounds like what Christmas is about. Jesus didn't have to be born. He could have skipped the entire manger situation and teen mother and just appeared out of thin air. But that's not the arrival God chose. And if an angel could materialize in a prison and rescue Peter from a lynching, he could have delivered him to that upper room where everybody was praying, instead of knocking on a front door but that's also not the arrival God chose. Look for the marginalized women. There you will see God. The future very well may be feminine, but if we ever think the reality or the realization of Jesus' prayer on earth as it is in heaven is going to come to fruition, the church must embody womanism. Lavender is too light a shade for the daughters of God. If not for a woman of color, there would be no good news.